Pavilion, and I'm going to be chairing this event, which is a great pleasure. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Just a quick reminder that we are being live streamed on Facebook, I think, as of now. I've got a few bits of housekeeping before we start this session, and some good news to start with, which is that you might recall that we've been looking for MPs to champion the cause of those who've been excluded because of the 50k ceiling on the self-employed scheme. And I'm really pleased to be able to let you know that Esther McVeigh and Philip Davis have confirmed that they are happy and willing to take on that group together to be the champions for that group. And I think that's really important, and we've been wanting to find some MPs to do that for a while. And I think it's even more topical given that just last week there was a report from the IFS suggesting that there were over 225,000 UK taxpayers in that group. So I know that Esther and Philip's offer of support and to speak up for that group will be really, really appreciated. Moving on, it's been a busy couple of weeks for the APPG. We've been exploring and putting forward a number of different proposals for different groups. Most recently, our so-called TIGS scheme, the Targeted Income Grant Scheme, was submitted to the Treasury on the 19th of January. And we think that if it were accepted by the government, it would be a huge step forward because it does offer desperately needed support to several excluded groups and is designed to be a ready-made solution to short and medium-term difficulties. But we obviously continue to push for fair, equitable, long-term solutions to close all the gaps in the support for all the different groups for which we're advocating. But we're hoping that that TIGS proposal could open up the opportunities for further dialogue around additional schemes. And I know all of you will be as frustrated and angry as I am about the amount of time it is taking to get progress on this whole issue. And we are painfully aware of how dire the situation is for so many of our constituents. Ultimately, the decision on whether to offer fair support rests with the government, but we will be doing all we can to maintain that pressure and hope that the Treasury will do the right thing. And we'll be looking to those excluded taxpayers to help kickstart the economy in the months ahead. So you would have thought that the Treasury might want to give them the support they need right now. But moving to today's meeting, today we are focusing on those in the creative sector. And we have a great panel made up of representatives of three groups whose members have been all excluded from government support. We've got representatives from Bectu, the Advertising Producers Association, and Equity. And my constituents in Brighton, as I'm sure many of your constituencies too, is home to significant numbers of people in the creative sector: the actors, the singers, the dancers, the set designers, the directors, the stage managers, puppeteers, comedians, the list goes on. It is a sector that is internationally recognised, worth over 100 billion to the UK economy. And it's also bound up with our sense of ourselves, I think, as a nation. And yet huge numbers of people working in the sector are PAYE freelancers and are losing out. One of our APPG vice chairs, Tracy Brabin, has of course herself worked in this sector. She knows it incredibly well, and she's going to say a few words of introduction before we move to our speakers. Tracy.
Thank you, Caroline. And can I say a huge thank you to the Secretariat and to the MPs who are part of this all-party parliamentary group, because it is truly cross-party. And certainly that is the only way that you can get government's interest if their own backbenchers and their frontbenchers are also minded to campaign on this subject. Certainly back in March, when the first lockdown happened, I was vividly aware that only 4 years prior to me becoming an MP, I would absolutely be knocked sideways by the lockdown. I've spent 3 decades as an actor and a writer. All my friends and musicians, actors, creatives, directors, they work behind the scenes in VisFX, in film, TV. We know the impact that that lockdown had on all of us. And certainly I would definitely be one of the excluded if I was still an actor and a writer. So I feel your pain, and certainly putting out a request on Twitter. I don't think I knew what I was letting myself in for, requesting stories and information and firsthand experiences of what lockdown meant to you. And I got in about a week over 4,000 submissions, and I turned that into a paper that I then submitted to these DCMS Select Committee as evidence of the impact and how government must step up for our creative sector. Because let's not forget, post-Brexit and also for healing going forward, we absolutely need our creative industries. It was before this pandemic a sector that was expanding. Even just West Yorkshire alone, 10.9% expansion in 2019 to 2018. This is a massive employer, and absolutely hasn't lockdown proved to us how we need culture in our lives, and whether that's turning on the radio in the car, watching culture in quarantine, getting a video of someone doing a ballet just to calm yourself down, or being able to access music or streaming from venues or gigs, and over Christmas and New Year, downloading New Year's Eve playlists and so on. It's absolutely vital to our mental health. So I just want to say a couple of points. One, thank you to the trade union movement, because often creative are seen as not robust trade unionists sometimes, because you're very much in the gig economy trying to get the next job. You're not necessarily looking out for each other, but this has proved, hasn't it, that the trade union movement, when we stand together, we can get things done. So I'd like to thank Bectu, Equity, Writers Guild, Musicians Union, and so many others, Community and others, Prospect, and for all you've done. And certainly fundraising from those who are working to support those who aren't has really saved people's mental health, I'm sure. But also it's about how we go forward. We have managed to persuade the government that insurance was needed to underwrite film and TV. So there is live streaming that can be done in empty spaces, which is good because you can still employ actors and you can employ musicians if the obviously social distancing is adhered to. So that's really good. It means that some actors are also employed, which is great. We're still making the case that we need insurance to underwrite theatre and a date to get back to work, because of course across the country our theatres managed to just get going again and now we're closed. So this has had a massive impact on theatres and the possibility for freelancers to be employed. And certainly as someone who has two actors in the family, both my daughters are actors. One finished drama school and had started work, and one had just finished her MA, and both waiting for this pandemic to end. And the strain on mental health is really tough. And so thank you again to the unions for the work you've done supporting the helplines and so on for our mental health. I would say that going forward, we must look to the creative industries to heal us and to bring us back together. And that's why I'm so pleased that we've managed to get something into government that will hopefully certainly look after those PAYE freelancers, those people that work potentially in film companies or working 50% of their income is potentially working in schools on PAYE, and then they freelance as musicians in a club or whatever. I think that's really important that we keep the pressure on, because we need to make sure that once the pandemic is over, that you are still in the sector, because my worry is that this pandemic will cut away all those people that don't have family income or savings, and they just think, well, it's just not worth it. I can't continue. Certainly if you're, as my husband and I were both freelancers with young children, those costs of childcare and so on really expensive, and it means that potentially we could lose a whole raft of talented creatives from the sector, potentially working class voices that we will never get back again, diverse members of our industry that potentially will go to another sector where they can get some stability in their lives. So thank you to the unions, thank you to the APPG for being the champions of this sector. And honestly, my heart goes out to every single creative who is waiting for that moment when they can get back and do the thing, not just that they love to do, but they've trained for all their lives, and they have so much to give. So thanks ever so much, Caroline. Unfortunately, I have to go at past, but I'll be on the call until then. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy, and thanks for being such a powerful champion for that sector. I'm delighted now to introduce Philippa Childs, who is the head of Bectu and Deputy General Secretary at Prospect. We're delighted to have you with us, Philippa, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Caroline. And can I start by saying a big thank you to this group for all the work that you have been doing over the many months. I think the collective effort that all of those excluded, the unions and MPs, mayors, and so on, have been putting on the government around these people who face such a difficult situation has been really brilliant, and hope, certainly we deserve to get some result out of that, and hopefully we will before too long. So Bectu represents people who largely work behind the scenes, behind the camera, across film and TV, continuous drama, factual TV, theatre and live events. And we've had huge numbers of members who've been excluded from government support. So just a few sort of statistics. I think the Film and TV Charity did some research that suggested that of the hundreds of thousands of people who work in TV, they largely fell into three groups of more or less equal size. A third who operated as sole traders, and therefore were able to get a self-employed income support scheme. A third who worked as limited company directors, who've obviously been impacted, and a third who work as PAYE freelancers. And obviously we've got huge numbers of members in all of those categories. So it became very clear to us very early on the problems that both the job retention scheme and the self-employed scheme presented for the creative sector, and with others, yourselves, work very hard to try to highlight the inequities to government. And we had various interactions with the Treasury around our ideas for solutions, which I think are very similar to lots of the solutions that you've come up with and other organisations have come up with. But obviously, so we have members who obviously fall into the category of over the 50k cap, so they didn't get any support at all. People who work partly self-employed and partly PAYE, and didn't qualify for either of the schemes for that reason. We've got people who were obviously new starters. So you name it, there are people who are impacted by being excluded. And I think what really frustrates me is that there seems to have been a lack of understanding about how employment and engagement in this hugely important sector works. I just realised I don't know how long I've got, so stop me if I'm going on for too long.
You've got another 5 minutes, I reckon.
All right, lovely, thank you, Caroline. So I think it's important to understand what happens in say on a film set, for example. So, and I'm going to focus a little bit on the PAYE freelancers, because I certainly feel that they are a bit of a forgotten group, and they've sort of got the double whammy of paying PAYE, but having very few employment rights in reality. So what happens on a film production is the production will set up a special purpose vehicle to engage its workforce through, and they will bring on board the freelancers that they need to work on that particular production. And we're talking about people largely in things like hair and makeup, costume and wardrobe, props, locations, art department, roadies, roadies and live events, music, tech people. But on a film set, though the special purpose vehicle would engage individuals on PAYE, and they would register them for tax and so on for the period of the production, and then at the end of that production the special purpose vehicle would be wound up and the PAYE freelancers would be let go, and ideally they would obviously move on to another project. But what we found during the early stages of the pandemic is we were all running around trying to ensure that people were furloughed, but they had to be on, as you know, the real-time information to the HMRC on a specific date. And it was really difficult because, in many cases, the special purpose vehicle had been wound up, and even though people might have been employed on that specific date, it was a problem to get them onto the job retention scheme. And we did manage to get large numbers where we, to be fair, the industry did step up and get as many people on as they possibly could. But we all know that there were many thousands who just didn't happen, when the music stopped, just didn't happen to be on a contract, and therefore fell through the gaps. And our argument was, quite clearly, the HMRC has tax records for these people, and they should be able to look at those tax records and give them support on the basis of that. So we were sort of arguing for a special scheme for PAYE freelancers, which would, from our point of view, could be quite straightforward and not subject to fraud. Many of these people are, the lowest paid in the industry. Many have struggled to also survive through this period because they wouldn't necessarily have huge reserves behind them. Many will be starting out in the industry. And whilst it's good that film and TV is now back in production, I think it would be fair to say that lots of people across the industry have been left with a feeling of extreme vulnerability and trauma as a result of the experience that they've had. Many have had to rack up a large amount of debt. Many have had to give up their homes and move back with families. And many we know have gone into, have faced really difficult circumstances. So from our point of view, we would like to see a situation, and we've been working on all sorts of ideas around what a new deal for freelancers might look like. But I think we would like to see a situation, and we think certainly in high-end film and TV, it would be possible for the industry to respond and put in place some more protections for people who are in that particular situation, who are PAYE freelancers. They're well known to production companies. They often use the same people over and over again. But certainly it can't be right that people are paying PAYE and yet have very few protections under the law, can't qualify for maternity and family leave, can't qualify for redundancy and so on. So we think there's a real gap in terms of those people, as well as all of the other groups that we've obviously talked about before. How am I doing time-wise?
About a minute.
Okay, so I suppose my finishing comments would really be somehow or other, we have to persuade government to understand better this sector. As I say, hugely important sector to the UK economy. There aren't any easy answers in terms of making everyone employees because, of just the nature of the project work nature of the industry. But I think we would all collectively agree that going forward, there are things that could be done better to protect all of the groups, whether they be PAYE freelancers, whether they be people who do a combination of PAYE and self-employment, or whether people are purely self-employed. We have to put ourselves in a situation where those groups of people are valued by our economy, and that we look at employment and engagement in the round for the future, and not within very narrow lines, I think.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Philippa. You make a really, really powerful case, and it's a really helpful insight into how that bit of the industry works. So thank you so much. We'll take our other two speakers first, and then we'll open up to questions. And so I wanted to hand the floor now to Steve Davis, the Chief Executive and Vice President of Commercial Film Producers of Europe, representing the Advertising Producers Association. So Steve, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Tracy, and thank you to all you MPs for your work and support on this. I don't think I need to explain exactly what the issues are because you understand them. I should briefly say my members are companies, and they employ all these freelance people. So they're sort of indirectly my concern. But as far as production companies are concerned, they're very much their family and friends. And of course, every production can only come together with those freelance people, because production companies at their core are tiny companies, and they crew up for every single production. I think as you understand the issues, because of course anybody without work or support for several months is going to struggle financially. I don't need to labour that point. I just wanted to focus on one particular issue, because I think we had the support of the Treasury Committee last time, and it often went off to the Chancellor, then no action was taken. Some of the feeling of that, I think, was that because it was more complicated, as Philip has said, than the employed sector. And I think there's one particular issue I wanted to mention, which is the fact that many of these people work through service companies. And I think there was a feeling that possibly, because the government are unkeen on IR35 taxpayers and things, and see them as possibly paying less tax than they should or something, that possibly there was less enthusiasm to help them because of that. So I just wanted to explain really that they have no option but to be freelance, because that's the way work is in commercials. People are employed for 2 or 3 days at a time, and that you couldn't be a permanent employee. They don't have the option. They haven't chosen to do that. And of course, they also need to protect themselves against liability, as anyone does with a limited company, because say they were sued because they, I don't know, dropped a light on someone's head or something, they want their insurance and their company to deal with that. They don't want to be personally liable, as none of us do. So it's not some sort of slightly grey fiddle, as I sometimes feel. It's something they literally have to do. And I think with those people who are, as Philip highlighted, only one of the 3 sectors, but the one I'm focusing on, because I think there's a lot of these people, I would just like the people who work through service companies, who are individuals, they're the only director of the company, that's their only source of income, to be treated as employees are. I think that's the simplest solution. And that would provide an answer that would help, at least 50% of the people in this sector who haven't been helped thus far.
Thanks, Steve. I think you make such a good point, and it just reinforces in some ways that the Treasury doesn't seem to understand what the freelance sector is like, and why someone might have to, set up a limited company. Otherwise, as you say, they simply can't get some contracts, or they might have to be a freelance simply because that is the only way that they can operate in that system. And it's not, as you say, some kind of dodgy operation. It's absolutely essential to be able to carry out the work that they're doing. So thank you for reinforcing that. I'm going to turn now to Louise McMullen. We're delighted to have you with us. Louise is the Policy Development Officer with Equity. So the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and thanks very much for including us in the conversation this morning. It's funny, I've just been scrolling through the list of participants in this call, and there's a lot of very familiar names who I've seen. Many of our members who've been lobbying their MPs since March last year. I know that a lot of you have taken forward their cases and have spoken up on their behalf, on behalf of all creative workers. So we're very, very grateful, not just for the support when shutdown happened, but for your tenacity in keeping up those arguments and keeping the pressure on. And I think it is hopefully starting to show that we're not going away anywhere, and that something needs to change very, very soon, or else we're really going to put this industry at risk. As a lot of you already know, and as Tracy's explained, Equity represents 47,000 creative workers. Traditionally, people say this is the Actors Union, but we also represent people who work as stage management, choreographers, theatre directors and designers, stunt performers, comedians, light entertainment workers, singers, dancers, all sorts of different crafts. So not to repeat too many of the arguments that have already been really well put by Tracy and by Philippa in particular, I just wanted to share a couple of snapshots, statistics and figures from our membership survey that we're running. We've been doing these quarterly as the crisis has kind of progressed, and the most recent figures are quite depressing, but they really do hammer home the need for urgent change to the government support schemes. And we're also, we've added in some new questions in our most recent survey on impact of the crisis, which I think is really important to highlight. So I'm just going to run through them very, very quickly, and happy to share sort of a fuller report with the Secretariat after the meeting. So similar to the figure that Philippa noted, and I know it's the same for colleagues over in the Musicians Union as well, we're consistently finding that around 40% of our members have been excluded from all government financial support packages. And the biggest groups of people who are excluded are the people who have that split of PAYE, freelance work, and self-employment work as performers or creative workers. But there's also a big tranche of new starters to the industry. So either people who are recent drama school graduates or people who are just young entering the industry or have entered the industry later in life who've been excluded. That is quite a substantial chunk of our members who've been excluded. But we do also obviously have people who operate through limited companies, personal service companies, and people who exceeded the £50,000 threshold for getting support. I think it is really important that they have a voice in Parliament, because they do feel very much, not just that they were left behind and ignored, but also as the crisis is now almost a year old, people who perhaps would have had a couple of good years in the industry, they've now had a year of pretty much nothing, a combination of no work and no safety net for them. So it's very, very important that someone's speaking up for them. Quite often they live in some of the most expensive parts of the country as well. So even if they've been characterised as people who are better off or who have earned more through the industry, they certainly aren't feeling that way right now, and they are struggling too. Some of the other findings that we've got are that 50% of members who did actually get a grant through the self-employed scheme have told us that it wasn't enough to meet their basic needs. So it's still falling short of support. And whenever we have challenged government about how about the workforce, you've given so much to the creative sector, the 1.57 billion. We've been told, well, money is made available to freelancers either through the trickle-down effects of getting work or directly through some of the funding that's been made.
Your sound is going a little bit, Louise. Sorry, I think.
Okay.
Maybe it's just a little bit closer to the microphone.
No worries. So whenever we've challenged the government, particularly around the spending of the Cultural Recovery Fund, we have been told money is made available through funding bodies and also through work coming to members. But what we found through our member survey is that only around 8 to 9% of our members have directly benefited from funds coming through those channels. And we also know that around 40% of our members haven't worked at all in the arts industry since last March. So where that leaves many people is obviously having to resort to applying for universal credit. And we now know that around 20% of our members are now dependent on universal credit as their main source of income. And I should say for performers, there is a stereotype that performers are often unemployed and they may be people who claim social security. I've worked for the union for about 12 years and I've run membership surveys throughout that time, and this is the biggest increase I've ever seen in people being dependent on social security. It used to be the case kind of around 2009, 2010, even when we were in the midst of post-2008 austerity and funding cuts to local government services and art services. Even then, fewer than sort of 8-9% of our members were claiming any sort of social security support, and that was mostly housing benefit at the time. So this is a big, big increase, up to 20%. What we're now seeing as well is that around a quarter of our members are trying to work outside of the industry, and another 20% are job seeking outside of the industry. They're very, very likely to be working class people and people from other marginalised backgrounds. We've had a raft of stories and examples come through of people going to work as delivery drivers, in takeaway shops, in supermarkets. But the reality is, in a number of those sectors now too, and particularly in areas like hospitality, where our members have often had second jobs, a lot of those jobs are now drying up too. So there's very little recourse to other employment. We know that around 16% of our members are thinking of leaving the industry altogether. Around 20% of members have taken on new or additional debt in order to be able to cover their own basic needs. And 20% are telling us that they are not managing well financially, with a further 15% telling us they have a particular struggle at the moment with their housing costs. Some of you might have also seen that yesterday some figures came out from a sister organisation of ours, which is called Parents in the Performing Arts, and they're telling us that around 37% of women who work in the creative industries, who are parents or carers, they expect to stay in the industry. That tells us the flip side is 60% of them want to leave because they just can't balance costs and childcare and having to work as a freelancer or a self-employed person in the industry. They're just finding it impossible through the crisis. And we also saw, I think it was last week, there was some ONS data that came out that showed that there's already been a 44% drop in the number of BAME female arts workers, which is probably one of the most troubling statistics we've seen so far. So for our part as a union, we know that because of all of this, we not only have a financial crisis being faced by our members, but also a mental health crisis. So for our part in this new year, we're going to be investing £25,000 in mental health services for our members, including counselling support. And already so far across the last year, we've given out about just over 1.2 million in grants directly to our members, with a particular focus on people who've been excluded from government support. Looking forward, we absolutely support everything that this group is doing in terms of trying to get, in particular, the TIG scheme up and running. And if there's anything additional that we can do to support those campaigning efforts, we're absolutely ready to do that. But we also want to make sure that moving forward as an industry, and an industry that has a real potential to kind of help the economy build back better, we need to make sure that the workforce is covered properly and is able to get a proper shot at getting back to work, but also an equal and fair return to work, which means that our BAME female arts workers are back in jobs, that we're creating work for people who are from marginalised and working class backgrounds, so that we're not going to see a slip back into elitism, which is a real problem right now, and particularly because of that lack of financial support for people in the industry. So there are some good examples of how to do that out there. We would really like to see across the UK an approach a bit like they're taking in Wales at the moment, which is coming up with a cultural contract in return for receiving public funding for arts bodies. And that's where you have to make commitments to environmental sustainability, employment targets, and also inclusiveness around bringing marginalised groups into the sector. So it is a pretty bleak picture at the moment, and we're going to campaign so hard to try and reform these support packages because people urgently need them. But I would also try and give the message that we are ready to fight for a much better industry going forward, because the precarity faced by our workers right now is nothing new. It's always been there, but we do have a chance to try and turn this around as we come out of the crisis.
Thanks so much, Louise. That was a really powerful insight into the human cost of what's going on over these, well, it's a year now almost since many people had any support at all. So thank you for explaining to us what that means for your sector. And I think as well reminding us that this is such a huge part of our economy. I mean, even just in narrow self-interested terms alone, one might have thought that it would get more support from the Treasury, given that we are so proud of our cultural exports. It's what we kind of pride ourselves on. And yet, if we're not very careful, when we do get through this pandemic, we're suddenly going to realise that it's not there anymore because we've not supported it through it. So thank you so much for making that very clear. Okay, so we can open up now to questions. It's probably easier if people use the raise hand sign in the sidebar, but Jamie, of course, does things differently, our lovely chair. So Jamie has indicated that he would like to ask a question in the chat. So Jamie, over to you.
Very quickly, and I'm a co-chair, Caroline. We're equals. Thanks very much to Philippa, Stephen, and Louise. The point that's just been made, you've just made, Caroline, about the damage to the industry worries me hugely in terms of, and I said this before, Britain's soft power. We're well known for what we can do in the creative arts. Is it possible to work out concrete examples that we can put to the government, such as this is going to be the damage to regional rep? Louise talked about 16% leaving the industry. If we can work up concrete examples of things that are going to long-term damage the industry, then I'm sure we could try and raise that in the Chamber of the Commons. I'd just be interested to know what our three excellent guests whose talks have enjoyed, what they've got to say about that.
Okay, if I come to Philippa first.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Jamie. It's really, I think to be able to fully describe what's going on out there, I think it's really important to have good, strong examples of the impact that all of this is having. So I think certainly we could all work together. I know the Federation of Entertainment Unions would work together to come up with some a picture of what's happening across the country.
Does Steve or Louise want to add to that?
I'll just maybe add that the impact has to be looked at across the whole of kind of the cultural economy. We tend to think of the big ticket stuff like film and TV, but that is built on a massive grassroots of people who are possibly not being heard and not being seen right now. And that even extends to people who work normally as like children's entertainers or singing teachers, or lots of Philippa's members who work as say designers, or people who work on sets as electricians. They could very well leave and go into other industries, do other things. We are going to lose either some of our skills base or some of the grassroots that feed some of the higher end.
Thanks. Steve, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, it's all interconnected, as Louise says, because, you know, what you call the film industry is really film, TV, advertising, and the skills base and the amount of equipment and studios. It needs all three of those to be healthy to support it. But I'd be happy to try and work with Louise and Philippa on getting some facts and figures together and getting them to you. I think that's probably the best answer.
That would be really, really helpful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. Okay, so now I've got Chi followed by Charles.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and thanks very much for all the presentations. And my question a bit sort of follows on from the last one, is that there is lots of, you know, there's sort of huge figures being bandied about, and the film industry and some of the creative industries have huge players and stars in it. But what we don't really get so much is the impact. And it's great to, you know, hear working class, creative industry freelancers being mentioned. What we don't get so much is the impact on individuals, I think. And, you know, if the government says we've got £650 million going to the creative industries, that, you know, how does that trickle down, if you like, or doesn't it? So what would be great would be any sort of individual based statistics on, you know, how much somebody who might be earning the minimum wage is going to have lost, or somebody on the average for the sector. And then also, so individual stories, sort of, you like, from the bottom end, and, you know, how the current support that you know that the government tends to champion, you know, what that actually sort of means per person, or per head, or, you know, per person actually, rather than say per theatre or per film.
Great, thank you. Louise?
Yeah, we've got some numbers and some case studies, particularly on if you have had government support, how much you actually got, and if that was sufficient. I mean, there's some there are inadequacies even within you know, the criteria for people who do get government grant support. So we've got some statistics that we can share on that for sure, and lots of case studies as well of people all across kind of the industry. But what is particularly stark is, say, for instance, the number of people who worked on West End stages who are now in a very, very difficult situation because they have been excluded from government support, and the situation that they now face, particularly as young workers, is pretty dire, living in one of the most expensive cities in the world, really.
Yeah, I think the impact on young people, that's just something indescribable in a way.
Yeah. Anything from either Philippa or Steve?
Well, I think on that issue, and it's not directly on this, but you know, if you look at the issue of diversity and inclusion, which of course we all upped our game at, or tried to, following Black Lives Matters, giving opportunities to young people and new people from different backgrounds through this has been even, you know, it stifled the momentum of that would have been there otherwise. So that's another big issue, but I guess it's not directly relevant to the issue of financial support.
I think it is I agree with Stephen, though, it is a huge issue. And Louise mentioned that stark statistic about the number of Black women leaving theatre and the cultural sector. Just before, back in 2018, we launched the Theatre Diversity Action Plan, which was designed, you know, we already recognised that there was a huge issue around diversity in theatre anyway, and this was a plan to try to improve that situation, and we had over 100 theatres sign up to work with us to try and improve things. And there can be no doubt that this what people have experienced in terms of being excluded from government support will take us backwards and not forward. So we're going to have a huge amount to do, I think, as an industry across all of the creative industries, actually, to address that situation.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go to Charles Colville.
Hi, thanks very much. I'm in the Lords Digital Communications Committee. I'm also a freelance TV producer, so this concerns me and a lot of my colleagues. What I think I'm really interested in is looking at the 3-year requirement for getting any self-employment support. Louise, you talked about this, particularly for new starters. Caroline, you said that you were been going back and forth to Treasury to try and see if we can get any movement on that. There are 2 things I'm really interested in. One, what happens to people who've been on parental leave, both maternity leave and paternity leave, but also with new starters, how on earth, if you've just gone into the industry, you actually build up that portfolio of work to be able to prove that you've done it. I quite see in the first year, it might be problematical. People, when they first go into this industry, have a really bad, struggly time trying to actually get any paid employment, as we know only too well. Louise, I'd be really interested if you could talk to me about whether you think there's any kind of movement on that, and Caroline, if you can talk to me about whether you feel there's any kind of movement in Treasury about that particular issue and those criteria.
Okay, I'll hand to Louise first.
Thank you. Yeah, we've obviously got a lot of people in this situation, and for those people who have had work in their first year, perhaps out of drama school, or as they are a new entrant to the industry, they're particularly aggrieved because they've been paying their tax, they've been earning, they've been working, they're legitimate creative workers who should have had support. I think now that we have passed kind of the January deadline for people doing their 2019-2020 tax returns, the position becomes incredibly untenable for the government in terms of not giving support to any of those workers. So I would like to think, and maybe Caroline knows a little bit more about that than I do, that leverage of being able to say, look, these people are taxpayers and look, they just paid their tax bill. What are you going to do for them is probably quite helpful or powerful.
Great.
I might add one quick point on that, if I may, which is just to say that is, Charles, a key area of exclusion, of course, and we see that. But we also see in the production teams in our sector, rather than the crew themselves, they quite often move between freelance and employment. So over the last 3 years, they may have worked freelance for 2, and then had a permanent job for 9 months and got to freelance. So all those people were another subset who fell into no support.
Philippa, have you got anything to say about that?
Me, sorry, I wasn't.
No, Philippa, Philippa's got anything to say.
Yeah, I mean, that again, we've got huge numbers who fall into that category, and obviously it's particularly problematic if you're just starting out in the industry. But we agree also that now that the deadline has passed for tax returns for this most recent year, then it should be something that the government could now move on.
Caroline, so what do you,
I mean, I would only add that. Sorry, I was only going to say that I would add that now that the Treasury has the data that it said before it didn't have, it ought to be able to move on those people that now do have that data for the full year in question. So we are pushing that really hard, and it is part of our so-called TIGS proposal, the targeted income grant support for these sectors. So I mean, it's too soon yet to say what the Treasury is going to do with that proposal, but we'll certainly keep you in the loop, and hopefully we might get some traction, just because it's a much simpler proposal than some of the others on the table, and we're just hoping to make some kind of breakthrough with it. Christine, you had a question.
Thank you all for that. Like Tracy, I have an element of there, but for the grace of God, whenever we discuss this subject, because before I was an MP, I was freelance writer, journalist and broadcaster. So I would have been serious trouble at the moment. But I also wondered if there was some way you could give us some information, or if there is any information about the impact on the regional theatre, regional employment in television, radio, all these sectors, which I mean, in London, I fully appreciate what you're saying, but the sort of regional diversity as well must have been impacted by the exclusion of so many people in so many parts of the country.
Yeah, who would like to take that? Maybe Louise, do you go first?
Yeah, I mean, from our survey data, we do know that arts workers in the Midlands have been particularly hard hit. So there is specific work that we're doing there through one of the local kind of cultural task force groups to try and address why it is so bad there in the Midlands. One thing I would say about the approach in some of the nations, so Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, is that we recognise that additional efforts have been made to try and address excluded groups, and that grant funding has been made available on top of what has come through the main kind of job retention scheme and self-employed income support scheme packages. So, you know, those have been very, very important for a lot of our members who've lost out. And I think in particular in Scotland, there have been extra efforts made to try and make sure that people who have fallen through the gaps have had something. It's not going to cover everything, but we do recognise that that has happened in the other nations of the UK, and that has left England a little bit far behind in terms of our members.
Philippa? See you nodding there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually partnered with Creative Scotland to try to get grants to freelancers working in the creative sector, and I think that was, as Louise said, incredibly useful. I think we're a little bit frustrated that something similar hasn't been put in place in England, and you know, I think the real problem around the Cultural Recovery Fund is that although the DCMS say that money can be used to support people, the reality is that hasn't happened, and that actually there needed to be a targeted support for those people.
Thanks. Steve, anything to add? Or?
Well, commercials is quite a London-centric business, whether we like it or not. But I mean, the few companies that are in Scotland and Manchester have probably disproportionately suffered because work hasn't been going up there, and they certainly have been unable to provide their crews with work. So they're part of the support needed.
Thank you.
Thank you. It sounds as if it's a nationwide problem. It certainly does need addressing, particularly in London and in England at the moment.
Yeah. Thanks, Christine. Does anyone else want to ask a question? I can't see anybody else in the chat. Otherwise, I was just going to hand over to Flo in a second, just before we close the meeting, and thank our speakers so much, just to say a few words about how the all-party group is planning our response to this and going forward. So Flo, it'd be lovely if you could just say a few words. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Caroline, and thank you to Steve, Louise and Philippa for your words this morning and for all the support that you're doing on the gaps in support issue. The APPG takes a really keen interest in these issues, and we've had a lot of MPs writing to us about how to raise these issues in Parliament. So I think, given that we are now almost a month away from the budget, it would be really helpful to follow up after the call, perhaps with you on sort of framing parliamentary questions in a way to highlight some of those key issues that you have raised today. Louise, in particular, your report with some of those stats and figures would be incredibly useful, I know, for the MPs to use. And just bringing you along on the journey, we are refining our proposals. We are looking at various solutions for all the groups that have been excluded from government support. So we would really love your sort of input and buy-in into that as well. So I will follow up with you after the call, but if you have sort of any reports, data, questions, please do get in touch, and the APPG is always happy to amplify your campaigning work on this issue. And I'd just like to say a huge thanks again for your time this morning and for all your hard work.
Thanks, Flo, and a big thank you again from me as well to Philippa, Louise, and Steve. And as Flo just said, I think this timing of this meeting is good, because we've got over a month now just before the budget, and we will be following up in as many ways as we can in terms of pressure between now and then. And things like the parliamentary questions and so forth can be really helpful, particularly since, hopefully, as you've seen from this meeting, but certainly in all of the work that we're doing, it is completely cross-party. We've got people from all sides of the House who feel really, really strongly about this, and we'll do everything that we can to keep it at the top of the agenda. So huge thanks again. Good luck to you and all your members. Our hearts are with them, and we'll do our very best on your behalf. And thanks for working with us.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your support.
Thank you. Thanks. Take good care.
Thank you.